Emma parked her car outside her mother's small, white-paneled home, the place where she and her brother Jake had grown up. The house had always been a comforting sight, with its neatly trimmed bushes and hanging flower pots. But tonight, as Emma stared at the warm glow coming from the living room window, she felt a heaviness in her chest that she couldn't quite place. Something about her mother's recent behavior had been bothering her. A subtle coldness, an indifference to Emma's struggles that seemed to have deepened over the past year. She shook the thought from her mind, grabbed the bottle of wine she'd brought, and walked up the familiar steps to knock on the door. Her mother, Margaret, opened it almost immediately, a forced smile on her face. "Emma, you're early," she said, stepping aside to let her in. Emma hesitated for a moment, catching a glimpse of the dining table already set for two. "Is someone else coming?" she asked, trying to sound casual. Margaret shook her head quickly. "Oh, no, I just thought I'd set everything up early. You know how I like to be prepared." Emma nodded, but something about her mother's tone felt off. She brushed it aside, telling herself she was overthinking things, and followed Margaret into the kitchen. The smell of roasted chicken and garlic filled the air, and for a moment, Emma felt a sense of nostalgia. This was what she loved about these monthly dinners, the chance to reconnect, even if it often felt one-sided. As they sat down to eat, Emma noticed her mother seemed distracted, glancing at her phone every few minutes. "Is everything okay?" Emma asked, spearing a piece of chicken with her fork. Marguerite hesitated before nodding. "Oh yes, just a little tired. You know how it is at my age." She laughed lightly, but it didn't reach her eyes. Emma wanted to press further, but she didn't want to seem like she was prying. Instead, she shifted the conversation to work, telling Margaret about a promotion she was up for at the nonprofit organization where she worked. But as she spoke, she noticed her mother's attention waning, her eyes flickering toward her phone again. After dinner, while Margaret cleared the table, Emma wandered into the living room. The space hadn't changed much over the years. Family photos lined the mantel, and the same floral couch sat in the center of the room. But one thing caught Emma's attention: a stack of papers sitting on the coffee table. Normally, her mother was meticulous about keeping things tidy, so the sight of loose papers felt out of place. Curiosity got the better of her, and she leaned over to glance at the top sheet. It was a draft of a will. Emma's heart skipped a beat. She quickly scanned the document, her eyes narrowing as she read the contents. The bulk of her mother's assets, the house, the savings account, and even a small rental property, were all listed under Jake's name. Emma's name wasn't mentioned anywhere. She stood frozen, the words blurring together as a mix of anger and disbelief washed over her. "Emma?" Her mother's voice startled her, and she turned to see Margaret standing in the doorway, a dish towel in her hands. "What are you doing?" Emma held up the paper, her hand trembling. "What is this? You're leaving everything to Jake?" Margaret's expression shifted from surprise to defensiveness. "Emma, that's private. You shouldn't be snooping around my things." "Private?" Emma's voice rose. "I'm your daughter. I have every right to know why you're cutting me out like this." Margaret sighed, setting the dish towel down on the arm of the couch. "Emma, this isn't what it looks like. It's just... Jake needs more help than you do. You've always been so independent, so capable. But Jake, he has a family to support. He's not as strong as you are." Emma stared at her, incredulous. "Not as strong as me? Mom, I've been working 2 jobs to make ends meet. I've been helping you with groceries, with your bills, even with fixing up this house. Jake hasn't lifted a finger. And now you're telling me he deserves everything because he has kids?" Margaret's face hardened. "It's not just about deserving, Emma. Life isn't fair. And it's my decision to make. You don't understand how hard it is for Jake. He's under so much pressure." Emma felt a lump forming in her throat, a mix of anger and sadness threatening to overwhelm her. "You don't think I'm under pressure? You don't think I've had to make sacrifices? All these years, I've been doing everything I can to make you proud, to support you, and this is how you repay me?" Margaret looked away, her silence speaking volumes. Emma waited for her to say something, anything, that would make this betrayal easier to stomach, but no words came. Finally, Emma shook her head, tossing the will back onto the coffee table. "You know what, Mom? Do whatever you want with your money, but don't expect me to stick around and watch you reward Jake for doing nothing while you treat me like I don't exist." Without waiting for a response, Emma grabbed her coat and stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind her. The cold night air hit her like a slap, but she barely noticed as she made her way to her car. Her hands shook as she gripped the steering wheel, tears streaming down her face. She had always known her mother favored Jake, but this was something else entirely. It wasn't just favoritism. It was erasure. As she drove home, Emma replayed the conversation in her mind, her mother's words cutting deeper with each repetition. "Life isn't fair." That was all Margaret had to say to justify years of neglect, years of taking Emma's support for granted while showering Jake with unconditional love and resources. By the time she pulled into the driveway of her modest apartment complex, Emma felt emotionally drained. She sat in her car for a long time, staring at the darkened windows of her building. For years, she had told herself that family was worth fighting for, that her mother's approval was something she needed to earn. But now, for the first time, she wondered if she had been fighting for something that was never truly hers to begin with. "Dad." She stepped out of the car, the cold biting at her skin, and walked inside. As she locked the door behind her, Emma made a decision. She wouldn't confront Jake. Not yet, anyway. But she also wouldn't continue being the silent, invisible daughter who gave and gave without receiving anything in return. It was time to focus on herself, even if it meant leaving behind the one person she had always tried to please. For the first time in her life, Emma realized she didn't need her mother's approval to feel worthy, and that thought, small as it was, brought her a flicker of comfort in the midst of her heartbreak. The days following the confrontation were a blur for Emma. She had left her mother's house in a storm of emotions, but by the time she had arrived back at her own apartment, a quiet numbness had settled in. The initial anger she'd felt had faded, leaving behind a dull ache, a sense of betrayal that couldn't be easily shaken off. She hadn't expected much from her mother. In fact, she had long ago come to terms with the idea that Margaret would always favor Jake. But the will, the cold, clinical finality of it, had hit her harder than she had ever imagined. The words echoed in her mind. "Life isn't fair." It wasn't just the words themselves, but the way her mother had said them, as though she were trying to convince Emma that her lifelong sacrifices had never mattered. The next few days were marked by a kind of eerie stillness. Emma found herself pacing around her apartment, unsure of what to do with all the swirling thoughts. Her job at the nonprofit had been demanding as usual, but work felt like a distraction, something to keep her mind occupied. She'd thrown herself into her tasks, helping her colleagues, organizing community events, but every once in a while her mind would drift back to her conversation with her mother, replaying it again and again. The more she reflected, the more it all seemed like a pattern she should have recognized long ago. Emma's childhood had never been easy, but she had always found a way to make do. There had been a sense of pride in that, a kind of quiet rebellion against the hardships her family had faced. She remembered how her mother had struggled after her divorce from Emma's father. Margaret had worked 2 jobs just to keep a roof over their heads, and for a while, Emma had admired her mother's resilience. Emma passed away in June, leaving her mother through the upcoming visits. God bless you, but it had always been clear that Margaret's love for Jake, her younger brother, had been different. He had been the golden child, the one who could do no wrong. Jake had been charismatic, charming in a way that Emma could never quite mimic. He had always had an easy time making friends, was the star athlete in high school, and effortlessly slid through life with the confidence of someone who knew they would always land on their feet. Emma, on the other hand, had always been the quiet one, the one who preferred books over parties, who worked tirelessly to keep up with her schoolwork, and to support her mother financially when things were tight. While Jake was off having fun, Emma had spent weekends babysitting, helping Margaret with household repairs, and doing whatever she could to make their lives a little easier. There had always been the unspoken understanding that Jake's future was bright, that his needs would always come first, and when their father had left, Emma had assumed that, as the older sibling, she would be the one to take on more responsibility, to make sure her mother didn't sink under the weight of their financial struggles. It wasn't a burden she resented, but looking back, she could see how much of her own life had been sacrificed in the process. She had watched Jake grow up with fewer worries, and despite his faults, he had always been given the benefit of the doubt. Emma had always believed that, eventually, her hard work would be noticed, that her sacrifices would matter. But the will had proved otherwise. She thought back to her teenage years, those years when her mother had worked nights at a diner, and Emma had learned to fend for herself. She had taken on part-time jobs, doing whatever she could to help pay the bills. Margaret had always told her, "You're so strong, Emma. I know you'll make it. But Jake, he's different. He'll need extra support." At the time, Emma had never questioned it. She'd been proud of her independence. But now, with the will in front of her, it all seemed so clear. Her mother had always believed she didn't need help, that she was strong enough to handle everything on her own, and while she had been praised for her independence, it had ultimately led to her being overlooked, left out of the most important decisions of her life. Emma's relationship with Jake had always been complicated. She had wanted to protect him when they were children, to shield him from the harsh realities of life. But over the years, something had shifted. Jake had grown increasingly distant, more self-centered, while Emma had become more focused on her own survival. As she reflected on the past, she realized that she had allowed herself to become a silent participant in their family dynamics. She had let her mother's favoritism slide, thinking that if she just kept doing the right thing, kept working hard, things would eventually get better. But it never did. The most painful part of it all was the realization that, despite everything she had done, her mother had never truly seen her. She had always been the one who kept things together, the one who held the family's fragile balance in place. But now, looking at the will, Emma couldn't help but feel that it had all been for nothing. Her sacrifices hadn't earned her any recognition, any sense of worth in her mother's eyes. All those years of playing the role of the responsible daughter, the one who never complained, who always did what was asked of her, it had been a form of invisibility. Her mother had never understood the toll it had taken on her. In the days following the discovery of the will, Emma couldn't bring herself to call her mother. She felt a mixture of anger and sadness, but more than that, she felt a deep sense of loss. The dream she had held on to for so long, that one day her mother would see her, would acknowledge everything she had done for the family, had crumbled in an instant. And now Emma had to figure out what to do with all the emotions that had surfaced. The hardest part, perhaps, was the guilt. She couldn't shake the feeling that maybe she was overreacting, that maybe she was just being selfish, that maybe her mother had a reason for doing what she had done. But every time she tried to convince herself that her mother had acted out of love for Jake, the image of the will, the cold, impersonal way it had been written, reminded her that love had never been the deciding factor. It was as if Emma's entire existence had been reduced to a footnote, an afterthought in the eyes of the person who had been her first and most important source of love. The more Emma reflected on it, the more she realized that her anger wasn't just about the will. It was about everything that had led up to that moment. It was about a lifetime of being overlooked, of working harder than anyone else and never getting the credit she deserved. It was about the quiet erosion of her self-worth, year after year, as she tried to live up to a standard that was never really hers to meet. It was an overlooked worth and prevailed over her mind somewhere very deep within herself. At work, Emma tried to push the thoughts aside, but it was impossible. Her colleagues noticed the change in her. She was quieter than usual, more distant. They knew she had always been a bit of a perfectionist, but now it seemed like there was something more, something weighing on her. But Emma couldn't bring herself to talk about it. How could she explain the depth of her hurt? How could she put into words what it felt like to be erased by the one person who was supposed to love her unconditionally? One evening, after another long day at the office, Emma sat in her apartment, staring at the wall. She hadn't heard from her mother or Jake in days. Part of her wanted to reach out, to call her mother, to try to salvage something, anything, from the wreckage of their relationship. But she couldn't bring herself to do it. The truth was, she was tired. Tired of trying to be the good daughter. Tired of fighting for a place in a family that had never truly seen her. She realized that she couldn't keep pretending that everything was okay, that she could continue sacrificing herself for people who didn't appreciate it. Emma knew it was time to make a change. She didn't know exactly what that change would look like, but she knew she couldn't keep living in the shadow of her mother's favoritism, in the shadow of a family that had never fully accepted her for who she was. It was time to focus on herself, to rebuild her life without constantly trying to earn the approval of people who would never truly understand her. And as she sat there in the dim light of her apartment, for the first time in a long time, Emma felt something she hadn't felt in years. A glimmer of hope. In the weeks that followed Emma's realization about the will, a strange calmness settled over her. The initial surge of anger and hurt had subsided, replaced by a numb clarity that allowed her to focus. For the first time in years, she wasn't consumed by the idea of seeking her mother's approval, nor was she drowning in the silent resentment of feeling invisible in her own family. Emma was tired of playing a part in a family dynamic that had never worked for her. She needed space, and she needed to start thinking about herself. For the first time, her own well-being became the priority. That was the turning point. The moment she stopped running in circles and started making deliberate choices. She realized that the most important thing she could do was stop allowing her mother's and Jake's favoritism to control her life. She didn't have to play the role of the overlooked daughter anymore. She didn't have to chase approval or perform acts of duty in exchange for recognition that would never come. The idea of confronting her mother or her brother directly felt foreign, and though part of her still yearned for some acknowledgement of her sacrifices, Emma knew that this was not about fixing relationships that had long been broken. It was about finally finding a sense of peace in her own identity. But something gnawed at Emma, a quiet, persistent thought. If the will was not going to change, then how would she secure her future? She had lived for so long in the shadow of her family's needs that she had neglected her own financial security. As much as she wanted to disconnect emotionally from the idea of inheritance, the reality was that she needed something, anything, to give her a sense of safety. She couldn't continue to live on a threadbare existence, just scraping by. For the first time, Emma saw the weight of the choices her mother had made, and the ways in which they left Emma unprotected. Without realizing it, Margaret's decision about the will had forced Emma into a corner. But Emma was determined not to stay there. The first step was to meet with a lawyer. She had considered reaching out to her family's lawyer, the one who had drafted the will. It had crossed her mind briefly that maybe the lawyer would have some kind of explanation, some insight into her mother's reasoning, or perhaps he would be able to convince Margaret to change her mind. But Emma quickly discarded the idea. She couldn't keep waiting for people to validate her feelings. She had to take control. When Emma called the office of a reputable lawyer, she was greeted with a tone that immediately set her at ease. She scheduled an appointment for the following week. It felt like a small victory. She was doing something for herself, making the decisions she needed to make. The consultation was straightforward. Emma spoke with the lawyer about her situation, her feelings of betrayal, and the lack of clarity in the will. The lawyer, a woman named Sarah, listened attentively. When Emma finished outlining her concerns, Sarah gave her a sympathetic smile. "Legally," Sarah began, "you have a right to contest the will, but it's not going to be easy. You'd have to prove that your mother wasn't of sound mind when she wrote it, or that she was coerced into making those decisions. Emma considered Sarah's words. "But that doesn't really apply here, does it?" she asked. "I'm not saying my mother wasn't of sound mind. I feel like I've been excluded because I'm strong enough." Emma's voice trembled as she said the words aloud. She had never been able to express this frustration in a way that felt genuine, but now it was coming out like a rush of water. "I've always taken care of myself, and now that my mother is getting older, she's taking it for granted. She just gave everything to Jake. I never asked for anything. I never asked for this." She exhaled sharply, wiping her eyes. "I don't even know if I want her money. I just want to know why." Sarah was quiet for a moment, taking in Emma's words. "Your feelings are valid, but the law is very clear on inheritance. If your mother has made a legal decision about how her assets will be distributed, it's going to be difficult to reverse that, especially if she's still mentally competent." Emma's heart sank as Sarah's words settled in. It wasn't as if she didn't already know this. It was the hard truth she had been avoiding. But hearing it out loud from someone else made the reality even more painful. "But that doesn't mean you're powerless," Sarah added quickly. "What we can do is help you secure your own financial future, separate from your family's decisions. Let's talk about setting up a plan for you, something that gives you independence from your family's assets." This offer was a lifeline to Emma. She had never thought about securing her own future in such a deliberate way. She had always been a caretaker, always ready to drop everything to help others, never considering that there might be a time when she needed to invest in herself, to build something that was entirely hers. For the first time in years, Emma felt the weight on her shoulders begin to lift. She had been so focused on everyone else's needs, her mother's, her brother's, that she had neglected her own financial stability. Emma had built a career in nonprofit work, helping others, and although she had received praise for her dedication, she had never felt secure. The promotion she had been working for at her job had come with more responsibility, but no real financial reward. It was clear that, no matter how hard she worked, she wasn't going to be able to escape the feeling that she was always just a step behind. Her salary wasn't enough to put her on the path toward financial independence, not in the long term, not when she was constantly dipping into savings to make ends meet. The conversation with Sarah made Emma realize just how much she had overlooked her own needs in favor of caring for others. When the consultation ended, Emma left the lawyer's office with a heavy but determined heart. She had not expected to find any immediate solution to her problem with the will, but she now had a new focus. She could start saving, investing, and creating a financial future that didn't depend on her family's whims. It would take time, effort, and careful planning, but it was hers to build. The next several weeks became a blur of financial planning. Emma took Sarah's advice seriously. She began meeting with financial planners, opening a separate retirement account, and looking into investment opportunities that might help her build the security she had always lacked. She started a strict budget, cutting back on unnecessary expenses and focusing on the essentials. The more she delved into her finances, the more empowered she felt. For the first time, she wasn't thinking about how to help others. She was thinking about her own future. She knew it wouldn't be easy, but it was a necessary shift. As Emma took these practical steps to secure her future, she also began distancing herself emotionally from her family. She didn't cut ties with them completely. She still checked in occasionally, still answered calls, but she was no longer available at a moment's notice, no longer the go-to person for everything. It felt foreign at first, but as time passed, Emma realized it was necessary. She needed to learn how to say no, to stop being the dependable one all the time, and to allow herself space to breathe. Jake had tried to reach out once or twice, but Emma was still processing everything. She wasn't ready to have the same old conversations with him, filled with pleasantries and superficialities. She knew that Jake didn't understand the full extent of her frustration. He hadn't lived the way she had, and he hadn't carried the same weight of responsibility on his shoulders. But more than that, Emma realized that the burden of their family's history was no longer hers to carry. She could step back, and she could find a way to live without constantly seeking their approval. And with that, Emma took the first steps toward true independence, both financially and emotionally. She didn't know exactly what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, she was looking ahead with a sense of determination and hope. The path was hers to choose. The months after Emma began taking steps to build her own financial independence were filled with a strange mix of progress and quiet reflection. She had always prided herself on being someone who could handle challenges, but the process of rebuilding her life from the ground up proved more difficult than she had anticipated. The slow, gradual work of saving, investing, and reimagining her future didn't offer the immediate satisfaction of confronting her mother or demanding her place in the family. But in its stead, Emma felt a quieter sense of control. For the first time in her life, she was making decisions that centered her well-being, not just the needs of others. She had kept in touch with her mother sporadically. Her calls were polite but distant. They never delved into the pain of the will, the emotional rupture between them. Margaret had sent occasional texts asking how she was doing, how her job was going, but Emma had learned how to respond with brevity, never offering more than what was necessary. As much as it hurt, she realized that she didn't need to offer herself to her mother for her love or approval. The relationship had to change, or it would collapse under the weight of its history. Emma's transformation was not just financial, it was emotional. She was learning to set boundaries. She had spent her whole life being the one who could be relied on, the one who was always present, always available, always dutiful. But now, when Jake called, asking for help with some minor inconvenience in his life, Emma found herself hesitating. She thought of all the times he had coasted through life, never fully seeing the sacrifices she had made for him. For the family, the idea of dropping everything to help him felt less like love and more like enabling his indifference. There was no malice in her hesitation, but there was a growing realization that she had to protect her own peace. That afternoon, when Jake had called for help with a simple task, something trivial like fixing his car door, Emma felt the weight of the moment. He was calling because he expected her to be there. The truth was, she had been there every time before. She had taken on so much for him, for their mother, without ever expecting anything in return. But this time, Emma found herself asking, "Why should I keep doing this?" The question was simple, but it held the power of years of quiet sacrifice. She had already made up her mind. When Jake finished explaining the issue, Emma let the silence hang for a moment before responding. "I'm sorry, Jake, but I can't do it this time." Her voice was calm but firm. "I've been doing a lot of thinking, and I realize I can't keep living like this. You need to figure things out on your own, just like I've had to." There was a long pause on the other end of the phone. Emma could almost hear him processing the words, a mix of surprise and disbelief. After a moment, he finally spoke. "Are you serious? You've always helped me. What's going on with you?" Emma's heart pounded in her chest, but she remained steady. "I've been serious for a long time, Jake. I've always been there for you, but it's time for me to take care of myself now. I can't keep doing this. I have my own life to focus on." There was another pause, and then Jake's voice softened, the words dripping with a slight edge of guilt. "I didn't realize you were feeling like this. I guess I didn't know you were struggling. I thought you were fine." The irony of his words hit Emma like a cold wave. She had always been fine, or at least she had appeared to be. She had kept her struggles to herself, convinced that her family's needs were more important than her own. But the reality was that she had been struggling for years. She had carried their emotional weight without ever allowing herself the space to breathe. "I've been fine," she said quietly, "but I've been pretending. I'm done pretending, Jake." The line went silent again, and Emma felt a sense of finality in the words she had spoken. She had told Jake what she needed to tell him, and she didn't expect an immediate resolution or an outpouring of understanding. She didn't need that anymore. She was no longer waiting for him to change, for her mother to recognize her sacrifices. She had finally learned how to stand on her own. In the days that followed, Emma continued her emotional and financial journey with a renewed sense of purpose. She began investing in herself in ways that extended beyond money. She started to re-engage with hobbies and passions she had neglected, painting, reading, and even joining a community yoga class. She rediscovered what it meant to focus on herself without the constant pressure of family expectations. She realized that she had been living in reaction to everyone else's needs, and for the first time, she could live in response to her own desires. But then, one evening, as Emma was finishing up a quiet dinner at home, the doorbell rang. It was an unexpected visitor, her mother. Margaret stood at the door, her expression unreadable but determined. Emma had been preparing herself for this moment, but she hadn't known when it would come. She wasn't sure she was ready, but there was no denying the significance of this visit. "Mom," Emma said, trying to keep her voice steady, "what are you doing here?" Margaret hesitated for a moment before stepping inside. "I came to talk," she said quietly. "I know things have been difficult, but I don't want to leave things like this. I want to understand what happened, why you're so angry with me." Emma felt her pulse quicken. She had prepared herself for this moment, but now that it was here, she wasn't sure what to say. She had spent so many years trying to please her mother, trying to earn her love. But now that they were standing face to face, Emma realized she didn't need her mother's validation anymore. Her feelings weren't up for negotiation, and she wasn't about to revert back to old patterns. "Mom," Emma began, her voice soft but firm, "I'm not angry with you. I'm disappointed. I spent so many years thinking that if I just kept being the responsible one, kept taking care of everything, you would see me. You would appreciate me. But you didn't. You gave everything to Jake, and you left me with nothing. Nothing but empty expectations." Margaret's face flushed with guilt, and she stepped back, clearly taken aback. "I didn't mean for it to be like that, Emma. I didn't realize how much I was hurting you, but Jake needed help, and I didn't see what you needed." Emma shook her head. "That's just it, Mom. You never saw me. Not for who I am. You always saw me as the strong one, the one who could take care of everything. But I'm not okay. I haven't been okay for a long time." Tears welled up in Margaret's eyes as she reached out toward her daughter. "I'm sorry, Emma. I've failed you. I see that now. But I don't know how to fix it. I don't know how to undo the hurt I've caused." Emma took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment. She knew that the damage was done, and no amount of apologies could change the past. But as she looked at her mother, her heart softened. She realized that, in this moment, forgiveness wasn't about her mother's actions. It was about Emma's own healing. "You can't change the past," Emma said gently, "but you can change the way you see me. I don't need your approval anymore, Mom. I'm doing this for me. But I do want us to be able to have a relationship. If that's possible, I want to try. But it's going to take time." Margaret nodded slowly, her face etched with regret. "I understand. I'm willing to try, if you are." Emma didn't know what the future held for her relationship with her mother, or if it would ever truly heal. But for the first time, she wasn't holding on to the idea of something that could never be. She was free, emotionally and financially, to move forward. She was no longer defined by her family's expectations. She was defined by her own strength. As Margaret left that evening, Emma stood at the door, watching her mother walk away. There was no dramatic closure, no perfect resolution. But for the first time, Emma knew that she had done the hardest thing. She had chosen herself. And in doing so, she had taken the first step toward a future that was truly her own.